Well, hello everyone, and thanks very much for coming. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Assistant Director of the Centre of Islamic Studies, and this is the first of our public talk series, fortnightly series this term. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Amira Bennison. Not welcome, obviously, because Amira is well known to, I think, everyone here. Amir is very kindly stepping in at very short notice to cover a speaker who unfortunately had to drop out. Professor Bennison wears many hats, as many of you will know, as well as the professor in the history of the Maghrib in this department of Middle Eastern Studies. She's also the director of our Centre of Islamic Studies, which is hosting the talk, and she's the chair of the Academic Publishing Committee at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Throughout her career, she's been interested in the way in which different regimes and dynasties legitimize themselves, particularly in North Africa and Islamic Spain. Her first book looked at the impact of the French conquest of Algiers in 1830 on ideas of political legitimacy in Morocco, and particularly the importance of jihad. Since then, a series of books and many articles have explored similar themes, political legitimacy, focusing on topics such as urban planning, ceremony, and rhetoric. Many of you will know, and this is how, for example, members of my family, who were very excited when I came to work in Cambridge because they knew Mira from her TV appearances. She's appeared in several TV programs, about the history of the Middle East and North Africa, Europe's lost civilization, the 30s in colour, Islamic science, and the Ottomans. And she's also, as many of you will have heard, a regular contributor to In Our Time on Radio 4 with Melvin Bragg, as well as many other radio programs and podcasts on Islamic history. So delighted to have you, thanks, Amira, and talk today as in private power in the city of Marrakesh under the Almoravids and Almohads.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just realised it's a little odd to be introduced in one's own institution, but thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, so as Paul said, I've sort of stepped into the breach. This is a talk I gave a month or so ago, but I thought it would be nice to give it to my home institution, to colleagues, to friends, to students, and thank you all for joining us here tonight and coming along, even though it was, advertised very late in the day. I hope you'll enjoy it. As I've just said to Paul, at least there's some nice slides. So even if you don't enjoy it, you've got something nice to look at. So the genesis of this talk, also the book I'm writing, is, and I chose this title because it picks up the title of an article that I put in a book I edited called Cities in the Pre-Modern Islamic World many years ago. I've done a lot of research since then. I've done a lot of additional thinking, and I wouldn't completely stand by everything I said in that original article. That's what happens when we're academics, we keep on working, thinking, moving on from an original premise. And the talk today is really based on two chapters from a book I hope to publish soon called The Medieval Maghrib Cities, Patronage and Power. And the idea behind this book, and in fact the course I teach with Andrew, MES 39, is to locate actions on the urban environment in the context of an Islamic urban imaginary and the geographical orientation of the actual place. And to also think about dynastic modifications of what one might see as a quite stereotypical template to express a particular dynasty's power and identity. And I look at this through looking at the landscape itself, through visiting these places, through walking the routes that past subjects, inhabitants of these cities would have walked, but also by looking at how they're described in medieval Arabic chronicles. And one could always say that it's very difficult to be sure what actually happened from a chronicle. But since many chronicles are actually eulogistic or designed to present rulers in particularly positive ways in order for the author to get some, remuneration for his hard work. They're very useful for looking at political legitimacy. They're very useful for looking at the self-image of a particular dynasty, what that dynasty liked to be mentioned, what they thought was praiseworthy, what the author wanted to put in to get that reward for his work. So they're very, very, I've always used them for political legitimacy, partly because that's what they were designed for. So it gets me out of the bind of them not telling me what they want to tell me, because it is actually what they're focusing on. So Marrakesh is one of the cities that I consider, and I see it both as an example of interactions with broader Islamic urban tropes, what one might call an Islamic urban imaginary, but also a very unique city that expresses strong local Maghribi identities, but different identities for the two dynasties I'm looking at, the Almoravids, who are Sanhaja, and the Almohads, who are Masmuda, and I'll go into that in more detail as we go through the talk. Since not everybody here is an expert on the Maghrib, I thought I'd start with a little bit about the Maghrib before Marrakesh was founded in 1070. And just sort of give you a very, very quick sense of how Islamic rule began to be implanted in this region and where towns began to be founded. So this is sort of like, if you like, a little snapshot of the 7th century. The place names are not all relevant or accurate, but I'm just trying to convey the sense in a very schematic way that initially Muslims settled on coastal garrisons. They didn't really penetrate the interior. We talk about a conquest, but it's not a conquest of a vast amount of territory in a few decades. It's the creation of a route westwards and the implantation of garrison towns, often on the sites of previous classical or post-classical late antique towns like Carthage, Tunis, and you can see others here, Tlemcen, which was Pomerania, Ceuta, Tanja, all classical foundations which still had populations living in them at the time of the conquest, and were controlled by various, either the Byzantine powers to the east or the Visigoths to the west. So garrisons in coastal towns is my basic point here. When we move speedily on to the 8th and 9th centuries, you can see that Islam is penetrating the interior, that you've got regimes founded often by migrants from the Islamic East, but who are nonetheless supported by large groups of local tribes, what we might call confederations of tribes. And that's true of the Ibadi Rustamid Imamate. The capital is not actually on the map, which is a bit inconvenient, but it's about here. Then we have the Midrarids, they found Sijil Masa. We have the Idrisids, they found Fez. And something I find very interesting about this map is we have the Bagwata here. And I mentioned this in a lecture yesterday, but one of the interesting things about the Bagwata, which I mention in my book, is over successive centuries, they become described as being more and more heterodox or heretical. And one of the reasons I think that is they have no town. They do not found a town. So in contrast to everyone else who founds a town and has a base from which an image and power can be projected, a base where religious buildings can be built, a base where religious scholars can congregate. And obviously in this period, religious scholars are also the writers, the people who actually begin to write narratives, biographies, collate collections of materials that then generate a history of a particular dynasty. The Bagwatas completely failed to do this. The best they can do is have their account of themselves preserved by an 11th century geographer, Al-Bakri, who was writing in the 1050s, 1060s, and he's recounting something he found in the ex-Umayyad archives about a 10th century Bogwata embassy. And that's about the best they can do. And that account, in that account, the Bogwata very much assert they're Muslim, very strongly, but it's not recorded in a chronicle or any kind of literary production by the Bogwata because they don't have a scholarly group. And I think that relates to the fact they don't have a town. They don't have a central place. But everyone else does. As I said, we have Sigil Master, we have Fez, we have Tahat, all of which are new foundations and which enable these dynasties to sort of instantiate themselves in the landscape. Their towns also look to new central points, though, in order to describe themselves. So instead of looking northwards or across the Mediterranean to big capitals of the past, when these towns are described, they always make reference to places in the Middle East. Sometimes Basra, sometimes Kufa, sometimes Baghdad, and that may operate in a positive or a negative way. But the point is, those are their points of reference. So they are described by writers on their own terms, but also in comparison to Eastern Islamic cities of one kind or another. Too carried away with that, though. What happens in the 10th century is that these parts of the Maghrib get integrated into much larger imperial formations. Either the Fatimid Caliphate, which has its capital in what's now Tunisia, or the Umayyad Caliphate, which has its capital at Cordoba in the Iberian Peninsula. But it's a fairly untold story of the Umayyads, that when they reclaim the caliphate, one of their main objectives is actually to push back against the Fatimids. And one of the things they do most consistently is expand their control in North Africa and create a protectorate. My circle may be a little larger than it should really be, but I just wanted to give you this impression, these two imperial powers colliding in North Africa. And their cities, their capital cities, then become models for those who opt to serve them. So Cordoba becomes an extremely important reference point for tribal chiefs in North Africa who want to found their own smaller towns. Fez begins to have elements which copy Cordoba. And you see the same thing further east. You have the Fatimids with their capital at Al-Mahdiya on the coast, and then subsequently just inland at Al-Mansura. And then those cities provide models for people who build in the central Maghrib, in particular a dynasty called the Zirids, who are provincial Fatimid governors who found a set of new towns, including one called Ashir in the central Maghribi interior, literally using architects that have been sent from Mansura and Mahdiya. So these are really concrete, practical links as well as imagination. So that sort of brings us on to the period when Marrakesh emerges. And it emerges in the context of the development of indigenous dynasties in the Western Maghrib. And this is really the first time you have larger imperial dynasties emerging in the Western Maghrib. And they don't affiliate directly with imperial powers elsewhere, but they do indirectly in the Almoravid case, although not at all in the Almohad case. By the mid-11th century, when we see the rise of the Almoravids or Almoravids, there are two major cities in the area that they emerge on the Saharan fringe that I will just mention. Sigil Masa, which has been around for a couple of centuries by this point. And then another town north of the High Atlas Mountains called Agmat, which is about 30 kilometers from where Marrakesh was founded. And then below the Sahara, there's another very important trading town called Aldagust, south of the Sahara. And the Sanhaja tribes, we don't know exactly when they converted to Islam. It probably wasn't that long before the 1040s. But they become, as the slide says, increasingly connected to networks of small teaching posts, which are called rabats in this area. And the term rabat can mean many different things. Sometimes it simply means the action of gathering together and sort of girding oneself for war. Sometimes it means a physical place. Sometimes that physical place has a defensive role. Rabats on the coast in Tunisia tended to be defensive fortifications, but even defensive rabats tended to also have a religious aspect to them, where people would go and serve as guards, whilst also pursuing religious retreat, contemplation, or learning of one kind or another, and also teaching local communities about Islam. And that teaching local communities about Islam is very much what you see happening in this, what's now the deep south of Morocco, sort of the northern pre-Sahara. A lot of education from these little rural bases called rabats. And some of those rabats are connected to Kairouan by individuals who've moved from Kairouan to these rabats, or through people going on pilgrimage to the Hijaz, but stopping in Kairouan and studying with people in Kairouan. This meant that the kind of education being promulgated in rabats was predominantly Maliki Sunni in its orientation, because that was the form of Islam becoming dominant in Kairouan at that period. And that led on to the sort of the organization of a number of Sanhaja tribes behind a particular religious preacher, Ibn Yasin, who formed an alliance with certain chiefs of the Lamtuna and gave that new group the name Men of the Rabat, Almoravids, or as we call them in English, the Almoravids. Now that kind of coalescing of the tribes together is seen to, being influenced by their attachment to Maliki Sunnism, which wasn't particularly dominant in the region before this time, but also a desire to unite for political and economic reasons, to gain control of the trans-Saharan trade, to gain control of the entrepôts either side of the desert, to make profit from protecting caravans going backwards and forwards, and get involved in that emerging commercial world. And to that end, they captured Al-Dagust and Sidr Masa in 1054, which gave them control of that trans-Saharan trade. We tend to highlight the gold, like every museum exhibit you'll see will go on about the gold. Actually, the salt was more important. The salt's critical to life in West Africa. So the Almoravids, amongst other groups, controlled the salt mines of the Sahara Desert. So the rock salt they could mine was critically important to populations further south in West Africa who didn't have access to salt. West Africa, before you get to the coast, is extremely low in natural salt. And people need it to survive. So from the West African perspective, salt, there are, you never know whether these are just kind of, exaggerated statements, but a lot of sources talk about the exchange of salt and gold weight for weight, because it was so important to the populations of West Africa. So don't think that salt is the mundane element and gold is the precious one. You could flip that and see it completely the other way around. And after achieving that control of the Sahara and the trade routes going north and south, the Almoravids began to push over the high Atlas towards the next trading entrepot, Agmat. And we don't really know very much about the urban sites they had at this period, but they did have a few. And there's a mysterious place called Azougui, which is in Mauritania these days. And it seems to have been sort of their first sort of attempt at some kind of a more central place. We have a record in Al-Bakri saying Abdullah ibn Yasin ordered the Emir Yahya to fortify the Lamtuna Mountains, a towering range with plenty of water and food throughout. 6 days' travel in length and 1 day's travel in width. There was already a fortress there called Azougui, surrounded by about 20,000 palms, built by Yanu ibn Umar al-Hajj, Yahya's brother. So these are the emirs of the Almoravid movement, working with Ibn Yasin, founding Azuqim as a central gathering point, surrounded by palms. Now that might remind you of something. I'll make you think of, Marrakesh set in its huge palmery. So there is a sort of a forerunner in a sense. But if we move on now sort of more directly to north of the High Atlas, the leader of the movement at that time was somebody called Abu Bakr ibn Umar. He was in Agmat, and Agmat is a bit forgotten as an Almoravid capital, but they did reside there for about 10 years. And there's been an interesting archaeological project running at Agmat, and these are the excavations of the palace area and the baths of Agmat, which appear to have been a little bit more impressive than we had previously realized, and it was probably quite an important town. It wasn't an Almoravid town as such, and by 1069, 1070, I think you could say the Almoravids are committed to expanding north of the Atlas. And once they made that commitment, they were also aware, I think, that they needed their own capital. So there was a lot of horse trading and negotiation with local tribes living in the area to find a new place where they could found their own capital and do what Islamic rulers did in the period if they were expanding their power, found their own city. They didn't want to just be residing in someone else's town. This is sort of the background to the foundation of Marrakesh. And here we have some of the accounts of its foundation. So you can see the first one comes from Al-Bakri, and the lines I've underlined, the opposite really, are just there because they point to perhaps to particular tropes and particular ways of looking at urban foundation more generally in the medieval Islamic world. So in the extract from Al-Bakri, it's actually the tribal leaders of Agmat and its hinterland. So they're saying, we've searched for a desert place for you with no fauna apart from gazelles and ostriches, no plants growing except thorn and colocynth, which is a kind of ground shrub. Which then seems to be slightly contradicted by the Nefis River Valley will be its garden, Dukala will be its fields, and the reigns of the Jabal Daran, which is the High Atlas, will be forever in the hands of its master. The point here really is, I think, to link the foundation of Marrakesh to earlier foundation myths, many of which describe how the foundation of an Islamic city, or I don't really like that term, a city by Muslims of a particular persuasion, is a transformation of wilderness to civilization, in this case, urban civilization. So there's an exaggeration of the aridity and desert-like characteristics of the environment. There's reference to these wild beasts, gazelles and ostriches, a lack of plants. And this is very much in keeping with actually the narratives of the foundation of early Ansar and Kairouan in particular. There's something else that's rather important. We see this in the second extract from Ibn Izari. So he says the construction of Marrakesh began with the Qasr al-Hajr, the palace of stone, and people hastened to build houses without an outer wall. The Arabic's a little bit ambiguous, but there are other sources that are very clear that Marrakesh did not originally have a wall. And this is really interesting again, because this also connects Marrakesh to the Ansar. Kufa and Basra did not originally have walls. They gained them subsequently, and subsequent cities were often built with walls, but in the case of Marrakesh, there seems to be a deliberate effort, reference back to this idea of the wallless city, which is important because it implies confidence. You're powerful, actually, if you don't need to build a wall. And it's also suitable for tribal populations. And if you think of the early Islamic Ansar, they were for migrating tribesmen coming out of the Arabian Peninsula, used to a particular environment, as with, in fact, the Sanhaja Almoravids coming out of the Sahara and wanting to settle somewhere which, to some extent, replicates their homelands. And then we have, on that very day, the Emir Abu Bakr ibn Umar, his clan and his entourage rode out with the Masmudid chiefs and the labourers. And work on the foundations began with their participation in help, which took the form of men and money. So it's a collaborative effort, but again, we have a bit of a trope here. The idea of the ruler as being personally engaged in the foundation of his city. And that appears in very different ways in different sources and accounts of the foundation of different cities across the Islamic world. But this is one thread, the idea of the to some extent humble ruler getting stuck in and involved with the project. Obviously, when it came to Al-Mansur and Baghdad, he wasn't quite so humble in his engagement with the foundation of a city. But this idea of being actively involved is quite important. And we see that again in the third extract, which wrongly attributes the foundation of Marrakesh to Abu Bakr's successor, Yusuf bin Tashfin, and gives a completely different date. But then rather interestingly mentions that he built a mosque. But then when he initiated the construction of the mosque, he got involved with making the bricks and building alongside the labourers. So we see this same trope. And that had appeared earlier, in fact, when the Ibadis were founding their early estate, and the city of Farhat was just coming into being. Ibn Rustam is described in many myths as being actively involved with the manual labour of building. So we have this sense of actual involvement of the Almoravid emirs, Abu Bakr then Yusuf bin Tashfin, in actually shaping the city. One thing I would say about, it's slightly tangential, but it's quite interesting, is if you're thinking, well, why does Ibn Abi Zar think Yusuf bin Tashfin founded Marrakesh when all the other sources say Abu Bakr? I would suggest that one reason is because very soon after he began to construct Marrakesh in 1070, Abu Bakr had to return to the desert to quell a rebellion among the Saharan tribes against Almoravid domination. And the heartlands of the Almoravid Empire, from Abu Bakr's perspective, were the Saharan south, not the north. So he spent most of the rest of his career in the deep south. And he gradually delegated authority in the north to Yusuf bin Tashfin, and Ibn Abi Zar is writing later from Fars. So he has no real interest or cognizance of Abu Bakr. But he knows about Yusuf bin Tashfin because it was under Yusuf bin Tashfin that Fars was conquered and the north was conquered. So the foundation story kind of gets rewritten, and there's just an assumption in the north that it was always all about Yusuf bin Tashfin. So poor old Abu Bakr draws the short straw. So just to sort of recap and think a little bit more about some of these urban tropes in Marrakesh's foundation myths. I find it very interesting that such a late foundation, 1070, over 400 years after the foundation of Amsar like Kufa and Basra, is still referring back to that imaginary. The Almoravids don't pick up on ideas related to foundations by the Fatimids or the Umayyads in the 10th century. They flip back to the 7th, 8th centuries, and they conceptualize Marrakesh, or those writing about the city conceptualize Marrakesh very much as a Misr. I would say that although the sources are later, they do draw on an Almoravid era chronicle written by someone called Ibn as-Sayrafi. So there's a fair chance that they are, expressing ideas that are around in the Almoravid period itself. So I didn't really say very much previously, but about the overcrowding issue. But this is a common trope for why you move away and build a new city. And it's politically quite neutral, of course. It's not saying that we've got fed up with the rulers of Agamat or that they're throwing us out, but it's this. Well, the town's just too full. We need to find somewhere else to build a city. The transformation of wilderness, which I've already mentioned, this notion of a Misr being unwalled. And one can take that one step further. There are somebody called Giovanna Calasso has written an article about conceptualizing ulama as the gates of a city. And that if you've got a strong religious cohort within your city, you almost don't need the gates, that you have a kind of religious divine protection through having a stalwart, strong, firmly grounded religious class. So she's written an article about this idea of, protection by other means than walls. But I've also given you some other reasons why it may have been unwalled. Interestingly enough, it was only walled in 1126 when the Almoravids were under threat from the Almohads and the tribes of the high mountains. So it is in fact only walled once there's an external threat. Until that point, it remains quite open. There's an emphasis on simplicity, on mud brick dwellings. And one final point I'd like to make is that whilst a lot of the sources, particularly those written in the north, talk about Marrakesh as a meaningless name, or a name related to, it was the name of a black brigand who lived in the environment. Is that what you name your city after? A local black brigand? It's highly unlikely. But there's lots of these very negative ways of interpreting what Marrakesh means by northerners who don't know the Sanhaja language. Or they say it's to do with, it's from a local Berber word meaning to run fast. I mean, these are just ways of demeaning the name, making it meaningless. But Moroccan scholars who've worked on this and who've looked at medieval languages from the region say it's actually made up of two words, Amur Yakush, which meant domain of God. So it's a name of deep meaning for the Almoravids. They are instantiating their introduction of Maliki Islam in their capital, in its name. This is the domain of God. So actually it's a very meaningful name, not a meaningless name. Also, you mentioned the ruler as a humble participant. I just wanted to also quickly show you a plan. Almoravid Marrakesh was sort of just this rectangle. This southern part wasn't yet built. And I just wanted to indicate how it has some of the features you'd expect in Misr, but it compiles them in a slightly different way, which we might see as related to Sanhaja practices. So Yusuf bin Tashfin building bricks for his mosque, which he put there in that part of town, which is very central, where most people would have been living, where the market area would have been. But he built his palace, the Qasr al-Hujja, the stone fortress or palace in this area. And this was the area where you also had the big parade grounds, something called what it's called in this part of the Maghrib, the Rahba, which is a big open plaza where tribal groups could gather, meet. And I would argue that it's eccentric following Saharan practice, and particularly of the Sanhaja, that it was very common for the tribal emirs to meet very regularly as large groups. And they made all their agreements as a collective together. When an heir was nominated, it needed tribal verbal acclamation. you can't really do that unless you have a big open space where you can gather all those tribes. So I'd say that the Qas al-Hajr is on the edge because you need to be able to draw in the tribes, both those in the city and those in the hinterland. But also they're a very open dynasty. If any of you have worked on the Turks in the east, in Baghdad or Samarra, you know, they're very open. Like they parade a lot through the streets, their women ride and they're out there in public space. The Almoravids were very like that too. Sanhaja women rode, moved in public space, and it was the Emir would just parade through the city to the Friday mosque. He wasn't scared of being seen. He wasn't trying to hide. He wasn't trying to use one of these like colourful, like secret corridors to sneak in through the back door. He was very public, and it was normal to move with one's entourage through urban space. So I think that explains how it's designed, which does, you know, make reference to Islamic precedents. You've got your mosque, you've got your seat of government, your Dar al-Imara, but they're not adjacent as they tended to be in the early Islamic East. They're kind of separated, creating this processional pathway for the Almoravids to move in their city. So Marrakesh doesn't stay simple. Yusuf bin Tashfin's son, Ali, became ruler in 1106. By this time, the Iberian Peninsula, the southern parts of the Iberian Peninsula had become part of the Almoravid Empire, so it stretched from south of the Sahara Desert all the way up to the middle of the Iberian Peninsula and even further north on the eastern side. The Almoravids also conquered the Balearics, so Majorca, Menorca, Ibiza were all under Almoravid control for a short period. So Marrakesh became an imperial metropole, a capital of a very large empire. According to a letter sent to the Abbasid Caliph, 500 minbars, or was it 5,000? I can't remember. But anyway, from the lands of Ghana to the lands of the Franks, everything is Almoravid. That's how they presented themselves. So Marrakesh needed to grow, it needed to expand, and as with any imperial capital, it drew a lot of people in. And there's a historiographical tendency to see the city as being built in a way that was very dependent on Andalusi influence, or expanded at this point as sort of. But if you're an imperial patron, you take craftsmen and artisans from all your territories and you bring them to your capital and you get them all working. We don't tend to see that as being derivative or showing weakness for other empires. We tend to see it as a sign of power. We don't see it as a failing on the part of the Umayyads if they use Byzantine craftsmen. But I don't know, maybe Andrew, you do, I don't know. But so I don't think when Ali bin Yusuf recruits skilled personnel from all over his empire, it's just a matter of North Africans can't do anything independently. They have to copy Andalusi ways of doing things. I think you can see it as a more imperial narrative. And as you can see, he did many different things at this period. He expanded the Qas al-Hajr, he very much improved the city's water supply, and he built a great big new mosque called the Masjid al-Siqaya, and this little pavilion was part of its ablutions area. There's a few slides of this, mainly because it's the only Almoravid thing left in Marrakesh, so you have to keep on using it, and other infrastructural improvements. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, you can see the Almoravid Qubba there, you can see a big mosque next to it. This is a later incarnation of Ali bin Yusuf's mosque. You can see it in the background of the other slides. That's just to give you a sort of sense of where it sits in the city and the relationship between the Qubba and the mosque. So it's at the heart of the town. It was meant to be, very finely built, marble, nice paving stones, beautiful carving. And just to give you an idea of what Almoravid patronised mosques look like, this is the interior dome of the Great Mosque of Tlemcen, which they commissioned. This is Ali bin Yusuf's commission. And those other images are from the Great Mosque of Algiers, which is also Almoravid in origin. So quite splendid buildings. This is the pavilion itself. It's very unusual in a lot of ways from the outside, but I also want to draw your attention to the fact that the inside looks very much like it's modelled on the design of some of the inner domes of the Great Mosque of Cordoba. So a great kind of bringing together of artistic styles and traditions, both from the Sahara south, the Andalusi north, and also from the east, in what must have been a fairly magnificent new capital. So, moving swiftly on. This is a very sort of transitional slide. We're sort of moving between Almoravids and Almohads now. This is always described as the Qutubiyya Minbar. The Qutubiyya is an Almohad era mosque. And this minbar was actually commissioned by Ali bin Yusuf towards the end of his reign. And it was made in Cordoba and then brought south in pieces to be reassembled in Marrakesh. So it's originally actually the minbar of the Masjid as-Saqaya, not the minbar of the Qutubiyya. So it's an Almoravid commission. So the rise of the Almohads. The Almohads were a movement which emerged among the tribes of the High Atlas Mountains and the regions south of that. They'd originally supported the Almoravids when they crossed the mountains, but by the 1120s, they were rallying behind a preacher called Muhammad ibn Tumat, who was very critical of the Maliki jurists who supported the Almoravids and very critical of the Almoravids for relying on them. And he was in time recognized as the Mahdi, messianic figure by his followers and as someone who was sort of restoring pristine Islam in the Maghrib and in many ways restoring pristine Islam throughout the Islamic world as a whole. In the 1130s to 40s, his successor, Abdul Mu'min, known as his Khalifa. So when we talk about Almohad caliphs, they understood themselves as caliphs of Ibn Tumat, and by extension, the Prophet Muhammad, but not directly the Prophet Muhammad at all periods. And you can see that, you know, 1130s to 40s, they begin to conquer all these different regions. This slide down here is their first great mosque project, which was built in the High Atlas Mountains at a place called Timel. Sadly, that's its restored state. Since then, unfortunately, it was almost entirely destroyed by the earthquake. It's now got wooden scaffolding all the way around it, trying to hold it in place. After they conquered Marrakesh, the Almohads had needed to do something with the city. They needed to change the Almoravid domain of God into their own domain of God. And they needed to do some really significant things to the city landscape in order to achieve that. And that took different shapes and forms. The chronicles are very, particularly those that are from the Almohad era, are very polemical about this. They say that Abdul Mu'min refused to enter the city until Almoravid mosques had been reoriented. We have no idea if every single mosque in the city was actually reoriented. That would be quite a large task. I think the likely answer is no, they weren't. But it was a rhetorical position because he was trying to say the Almoravid Qibla is deviant. The Almoravids are deviant. These mosques all need reorienting. You know, he's not entering because it's not a properly Muslim city. Everything's wrong. The Almoravids are wrong. The way they've oriented their mosques are wrong. He closed the Masjid as-Saqaya. It had just been, you know, it only really just been opened. It's described as being locked henceforth and not used for prayer, which is quite dramatic. There are not that many accounts of that happening in cities. He commissioned a new mosque. He built it next to the Qasr al-Hajjah. This is an aerial view of the new mosque, the Qutubiyya. That's actually the second prayer hall, so that's the 1158 version. And just to the left of it, you can see vaguely some archaeological remains, which are the pier posts of the first prayer hall, built probably after 1148. There's recently been an article in Muqarnas which kind of challenges that chronology completely, but I'm sticking with this one for the time being. Abdul Mu'min also began the process of building a minaret for the mosque. And this is the moment where these massive tall tower minarets become the norm across the Maghrib for minaret building. So it's a very important introduction. And he also constructs these estates, which are called Buhair estates, from the Arabic word Buhaira, the lake. So, but although if you read it, the first time you read it in a text, you think, oh, it's a lake, but it's not. It's actually the entire estate. They're like lake estates, if you like. And a lot of those lakes were actually artificial and built by the Almohads themselves. One important thing about this whole building program is not only does it reorientate mosques, but it reorientates the city. And you might say it creates a more traditional kind of model where you had the old Qasr al-Hajjah here. Now you have the Qutubiyya next to it. So you have a much more traditional mosque next to a Dar al-Imara or government. So that association is sort of restored, but it still remains to some extent unusual because it's on the edge of the city. Although perhaps not so unusual for this particular period. In the next few decades, Abdul Mu'min was succeeded by his son, Abu Yaqub Yusuf, and then his grandson, Abu Yusuf Yaqub, which as you can imagine, creates some confusion. And then the next dynasty, the Marinids, going to do the same thing, just like reuse all the same names, but the opposite way around, which makes life quite challenging. We tend to call Abu Yusuf Yaqub, the grandson, Yaqub al-Mansur, just to help us distinguish them. But from an urban perspective, what's important is that they continue to build and expand and develop Marrakesh, but very much along the path that Abdul Mu'min had already established. They build a new Palatine city, basically in this area, which is known as either as Marrakesh or as-Saliha. Marrakesh is a slightly puzzling name because, as you can see, it's very closely related to Marrakesh. In fact, it's the female version of the same word. So it is actually the same word, but Marrakesh is the feminine, Marrakesh is the masculine. It seems to be called as-Salih more usually in the sources. And there's a great addition of Baha'i estates. You can see there on the right, one of those estates, it's the Menara, which was probably one founded by Abdul Mu'min himself, but there are several of these huge estates built. And a whole program of massive stone gate building. And I think one of the things that you see with the Almohads is a much more extensive use of stone. The Almoravids do use stone in the Qasr al-Hajjah, as its name suggests, but they don't, and then in the Masjid al-Saqaya, but it's not really a stone city. But the Almohads introduced a lot more carved stonework alongside ramparts. And even when they have ramparts, they try to create the illusion of ashlar masonry through certain markings on the exterior plaster. So what are their discourses about Marrakesh? Why did they build the city in this way? What are they trying to do? First and foremost, they're trying to, we talked about them writing the deviant Qibla and transforming what they perceived as an Almoravid version of Mecca, a pagan center, into a true Islamic center. although it's not directly relevant to this talk, in Almohad narratives, they conceptualize Teen Mel in the mountains as a Dar al-Hijra, which is also a phrase used for Medina, the place to which the Prophet migrated to establish his new order. So Teen Mel is the place to which Ibn Tumar, the Mahdi, migrated to establish his new order. So it's seen as a sort of new Medina, which renders Marrakesh under the Almoravids, kind of Mecca, the place you have to leave because it's deviant, pagan, ignorant. And then it's transformed subsequently by the writing of the deviant Qibla. There's a lot of emphasis too on this idea of bringing water to an arid world. It does begin with the Almoravids, but I can tell you that it was first and foremost the Almohads who made the most of that. There's a lovely passage in a geographical work by Muhammad ibn Abdurrabbi, where there's this just little saying that, before the Almohads built all their lake estates, a bird would fly over the plain of Marrakesh and fall from the sky like a stone from the heat. But after all this urban development and garden building and lake digging, the bird could fly safely. It became a verdant, lush environment from having been a desert of excessive heat. The other point I'd just like to bring out is that particularly with Abdul Mu'min's successor, his son, and even more than that, his grandson, Yaqub al-Mansur, there's this idea that Marrakesh, with the building of Marrakesh and the adding of additional new elements, which I haven't yet mentioned, like a hospital, a royal market, as well as the other spaces that we've discussed, became literally a city of cities, Misr al-Ansar. And by this, Yaqub al-Mansur really understood his city as important in the Islamic world as a whole. He was trying to flag, actually Marrakesh is the best capital of its day. There's no other place like it. And this linked up to their own sense of themselves as the restorers of Islam, as heads of an empire, which was the most powerful empire in the Islamic world in that day. And apologies if you've heard me say this before, because I say it quite a lot, but Saladin, begged the Almohad Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur for help. It wasn't Yaqub al-Mansur who had any particular interest in Saladin. No, we tend to think of Saladin or Salahuddin as this very important figure. And I'm not saying he wasn't important, but I think, if you look at this world in that period, the Almohad Empire, which is rarely part of general histories of the Middle East, is actually one of the most significant Muslim polities of its era. And so Yaqub al-Mansur may be exaggerating a bit, but his city and his capital and his empire are actually genuinely hugely important in the 12th century Islamic Mediterranean world. So I don't want to test your patience too long, so I'll quickly conclude. I think Marrakesh in these two centuries, the 11th and 12th centuries, is a really interesting late example of a new urban foundation, which is then modified by two different dynasties and built upon in quite different ways to express their sense of themselves and their specific religio-political positions. And you also see them, as they do that, interacting with what I would call the Islamic urban imaginary, which had developed over many centuries, but which you see echoed down in the way writers describe these cities, the way they present their origin myths, and the way they sort of position these dynasties. But overall, this is just one example of how I kind of do this work and look at cities and use sources and walking the cities themselves to think about how different dynasties legitimised themselves, promoted their self-image through how they actually shape the urban environment, without, as I say, completely forgetting that cities do a lot of other things as well. I know they do, but that's not the focus of my interest. So that would just be a different scholar's work or a different talk. But my particular interests at the moment are what rulers do in their capital cities in particular. So thank you very much for your attention.